Hello and welcome to Beyond the Headlines, the future of restaurant staffing. I'm Parker Milner, food editor for the Post and Courier, and today we'll be digging deeper into my recent story titled Staff Shortages Persist at South Carolina Restaurants as COVID Surges. Some owners see a path forward. I'm joined this afternoon by Michael Shemtov, owner of the Butcher and Bee and the Daily in Charleston. In addition to his footprint here locally in Charleston, Michael has restaurants in Nashville and Atlanta, where he recently opened up a second location of the Daily. Michael also played an intricate role in establishing the nonprofit Pay It Forward, which provides emergency assistance in the form of grants to members of the food and beverage community. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit more about your background to get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Parker. I've been in the restaurant business my whole life. I was a college Charleston student from 96 to 2000 and knew while I was at school that I wanted to start a restaurant after. So my first restaurant opened January of 2001, and that was the Mellow Mushroom on King Street. At one point, I had 4 Mellow Mushrooms in Charleston. Now I'm down to just the one in North Charleston. We had 10 restaurants pre-pandemic. We're at 6 now, but we have a few more in the works in Nashville and Atlanta. So been doing it for a long time, not a chef, but I do love cooking. I love food. Really have always thought of myself as a concept person and more than anything, a people person. Just I like putting teams together, seeing people develop. So been thinking about people for a long time. And in fact, I think one of the things that you and I chatted about was how long we've been talking about staffing shortages and thinking about staffing shortages. And I just offer for the audience a little note that didn't make it in the article, which is that in 2015 and 16, I was working on the space that was Workshop. We closed it last year, but we opened it May 1st of 2017. So that means we started working on it in 2015. And it was a 10,000 square foot space. And one of my insights was instead of doing one big concept where we'd need a 50-person staff, why don't we do 6 smaller concepts where each person that would need a staff of 3 to 7 people. So we're already thinking about how to mitigate staffing shortages back 6 years ago, pre-pandemic. So this has been a simmering problem for a while, really ever since Johnson and Wales pulled up stakes from Charleston and went to Charlotte. It started to become more and more acute. And then really, coming out of the pandemic has become a crisis, as you described it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Johnson and Wales. I think we had a subscriber question before we started here, kind of related to that. So we should be able to touch on that a little bit later. But during the reporting process for this story, I talked to between 10 to 15 local chefs and restaurateurs, some that didn't make it into the story. And prior to the story's January 18 run date, I believe Michael and I had at least 3 conversations about this topic. And obviously, like I said, there were a lot of people in the article, so I could only include so much of my talks with Michael, but I'd really like to expand on some of our conversations here. And one of the things we talked about was the change in the hiring practice and how that's changed at the Butcher and Bee and the Daily. So Michael, I wanted to get us started and see if you could kind of expand on that and talk about how things have changed in recent years when it comes to hiring new employees.
Yeah, I think that a lot of these questions, they're sort of like, here's what it was like in the before times, and here's what it's like now. And it's interesting. I hope would be interesting for the viewers and the readers to hear about those changes. So, when I started the Mellow Mushroom on King Street, actually part of our MO was to try to talk people out of a job at the interview. And we felt like if we weren't able to talk them out of the job, then they actually would make a good fit. So that was something that we did. We sort of would listen to them, and then we would tell them every negative thing about that we saw that sort of might affect them. And our thought was like, if you hear that and you pass, great. If you hear it, you're say, I'm still interested. And when I say we made it difficult for people, I mean, we didn't have applications on purpose. We wanted to see when somebody came in and asked for an application, what they would do when we said to them, I'm sorry, we don't have any. You know, we want to see like who would say, can I go get one from somewhere else and bring it in? Or can I make my own? Or so we try to put up all these roadblocks. And then in the butcher and bee days, you know, we had a process that was like you interviewed with one person, sort of a gatekeeper type who just measured cultural fit and sort of attitude. And then you would meet with a few more people on the team over the course of a few days. And then you would set up a stage. And I would say at some point, we moved, you know, I don't know, close to a decade ago to paid stages. So we don't ask anybody to work for free. We pay them cash or write them a check at the end of their stage shift. But a stage from the French stagiaire means basically a working interview. And then after that, we would offer you the job. And then what we found over the last few years is we kept losing people in that process. And so now we've actually inverted it. Now our attitude is interview them, hire them right off the rip. And then we're going to look at their first shift, first week as a working interview. If it's not a good fit, we'll let them go right away. For their sake, for our sake, I always say, you know, it needs to be a win-win. So we need to see how they're going to benefit from working from us, for us, and vice versa. And so we now try to hire really quickly, still let people go quickly, but we just inverted the process and say, instead of a job offer like happening at the end, we now like, even if you're present well on paper, we might offer you the position and then interview you and then have the working interview. So that's been a part of it. You know, and talking to our team, just preparing for today, they said still, you know, if 2 people out of 5 show up for an interview, that's a success. And that's about the rate that we're running, is 2 out of 5 showing up for the interview. Again, we try to speed up how quickly we reach back out to them, how quickly we set up interviews. But even then, I think, you know, and part of why we reversed our process was just this realization that other restaurants are probably just offering people a position. There's so much desperation for employees that other people are probably just saying, just start, like you're offered a job. And so people may not be incentivized. They don't have an incentive to wait and do a working interview with us when somebody's offered them a job just based on their resume. So.
Yeah, and we just had a question come in here, Michael, and for everyone who's listening, whether you're listening with us live or listening to the recording afterwards, feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom chat. But Laureen asked, have you talked with a human resources consultant to get some standards for hiring and interviewing? And I kind of wanted to know, like, whenever you are interviewing these people, is there somebody who's dedicated to doing that, or does somebody who's working at the restaurant kind of have to take time from what they're doing and then to go do the interview?
Yeah, so great questions. I mean, for a long time, I mean, I'm 20 plus years into restaurant ownership. For a long time, I did almost all the interviews myself, if not all the interviews myself. At least I would do the first interview, or I would do a second interview myself. I like it. And also at some point I stopped and counted. I mean, I opened, 7, 8, 9 restaurants and over 20 years. And I think I've interviewed 5,000 or more people. I mean, if I just count how many people have worked for us over the years in Charleston, it's close to 1,000, if not more. So it's actually hard to just navigate the streets of Charleston to go out for a meal without running into somebody that I've worked with at some point in my life. But yeah, to your question, I mean, I did, when I started, I did a lot of reading about interviews. And so I used to have a pre-populated list of interview questions, and I studied a lot what technology companies were doing, because they were really at the vanguard of interviewing. And so they would ask questions. I learned from them to ask questions that really dig into somebody's mental process, like you wouldn't know the answer to. So I'm not saying that a line cook or a dishwasher would get this question, but we would ask a management applicant, for example, like, how many gas stations are there in the state of Florida? And we don't expect them to know, right? It's like, how many jelly beans would it take to fill Mount Rushmore? We just want to see, how do they work through that process? Are they just pulling out a sophisticated wild ass guess from their mind, or do they have some way of thinking, like, Okay, well, Jacksonville probably has X number and there's X number of cities the size of Jacksonville. And so we have, and I know that might not impress the reader that we asked this curveball question, but we got that from technology companies who are asking those sort of questions. So we have a certain cadence, and for anybody out there who interviews people, if this is useful for you, what we always do is spend the first section talking about that person, getting to know that person, about 30 minutes of that. And then if they've qualified themselves, then we'll pivot to answering their questions about us. And then at the end, we still explore anything that might have come up that sounds like a red flag. So that's the sort of cadence of the interview. We did add an HR position in the company a few years ago. So our HR director now posts all the ads and does most of the initial interviews. And then once they qualify somebody, then they interview with the person who they would be directly reporting to. So I am a believer in team interviews. I always tell the team that like the staff is like a body and the cells of a body. And like when something comes into the body that's foreign, that doesn't belong, all the cells of the body attack that person. I don't want our staff to like literally attack somebody, but I want our staff to all come to us and say, that person doesn't fit. And in fact, that happens, and it happens, I won't say regularly, but it's not unusual for us to get feedback from the staff about somebody not being a great fit for us. And we're big believers in like we used to be big believers in hire slow. Now we're believers in hire fast, fire fast. But we used to be hire slow, fire fast. But
yeah, and you mentioned team and the team element. I come from a sports background, as you know, and kind of when I was playing hockey, it was you just had to do whatever it took, and sometimes you weren't treated that well, and I think that's changing in sports, and it seems to be changing in restaurants as well, and has been for a while. Could you talk a little bit about your early experiences working in restaurants and what it was like then, and how it's changed to where it is now, and some of the team elements that you're implementing at your restaurants?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm certainly not proud of the entire history of the restaurant industry. I mean, there's certainly a lot of valid criticism for how restaurants have treated employees in the past, especially at the extremes, honestly, sort of the smaller mom and pop stores that have sometimes paid people, for example, a salary, but then scheduled them, 60, 70 hours a week, and really have not been in the spirit of what a salaried manager should be doing, to at the high end, for a very long time, cooks especially were just expected to get to work 4 hours before their shift started. Like they would have a list of things to do that would just not be manageable if they came in at 2 p.m. for their scheduled shifts. So it was a bit of a culture in fine dining that you just came in early in order to get your stuff done. We have always had a principle of like, we pay you for all the time that you work. Nobody's expected to work for free. If there's a staff meeting, everybody gets paid for the staff meeting. If somebody gets paid, say like the federal minimum wage, $7.25 plus tips, if they come for a staff meeting, we're going to pay them $15 for that hour. We're not going to pay them $7.25. But there's been, there's certainly been issues, and I think valid criticism. And I think a lot of the conversation is, why would people want to go back to these jobs that are so hard, where the pay is not as well as, don't pay as well as they can make elsewhere? And I think that's valid. It's worth exploring. When I started, I was making $9-10 an hour, and that was sort of the goal, was to make $10 an hour as a cook. Another thing, when we opened, we very proudly were open every day of the year except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I remember that at the Daily, one year we realized like, oh, we can open a half day on Thanksgiving, because people want to come in for breakfast before. So even like the old saying of like open every day but Thanksgiving and Christmas went out the window, because like, hey, we're now open Thanksgiving. But now the past 2 years, we've taken Thanksgiving off at the Daily. September, we gave our staff like company-wide a 2-day mental health break. We just have had to change the mindset. Instead of like, we're all proud that we work ourselves to the bone, it's now become more about, we need to preserve the team, their health, their mental health. And like one of the things that if you're not in the business, you don't necessarily realize is like being short staffed is a kind of a cycle that feeds on itself. So what happens typically, if you lose one person, if you have say 12 or 14 cooks in the kitchen and you lose one, not a big deal. You can still write the schedule, no issues. You lose a second one, now you're a little tight. Probably can still make the schedule, don't need to close another night. You lose three and you're like, oh, wow, we need to go out, then we need to start hiring now. And now you're stretching your staff more. Now people are working a 6-day. They're not able to take time off when they need it because you don't have the staff. And so it's a cycle that feeds on itself. Those people get burned out. They're more likely to leave. If another person leaves, now a 14-person staff looks like a 10-person staff, and that work is distributed on fewer people, making it more likely that other people will leave. So it just kind of feeds on itself, and it's hard to reverse. It takes time. It takes time to interview, find, train, sort of get your staff some support. So, we have now looked at it as our most valuable asset is our staff. And, I'm not saying that they're snowflakes now when we're all tough 10 years ago. What I'm saying is that we're all, I think, have realized, many of us in the restaurant business have realized that their health and their mental health is really important and has to be protected. And that we need to shift this mindset from, you should just be proud that you work nights and weekends and nonstop and that you're always on, to saying, no, that's not healthy or sustainable. So, some of that is just growing older ourselves. I mean, I'm 44. So it was a lot easier to work 35, 40 days in a row when you're 24 than 44. It's easier to do when you don't have kids and when your staff don't have kids. But again, and I would say like one of the things that we try to be mindful of is like, you can't have a set of policies for people with kids and a different set of policies for people without. You shouldn't be punished for not having kids by having to work different. But if we want to be professional and we want to retain people as they start families, that's been one of the other realizations. We just need to work with people and get ahead of people having kids and figure out what life in a restaurant business with young kids looks like. Mm-hmm. So for us, that looked like a savings plan. That looked like a more aggressive plan in place, especially before people have their first kid. They tend to think like, I'll take a week off and I'll be back. At least the ones who are not giving birth tend to think, I'll take a week off and I'll be back. But it's usually more than that. So,
yeah, and I want to ask you about some of the benefits that you're offering employees. First, I want to remind our guests that this event is being recorded, and you'll receive a link afterwards. And please feel free to use the Q&A button on the Zoom screen to ask some questions. It looks like we have a couple in. But first, on kind of the benefits and what you're offering your employees, could you talk a little bit about what you do offer your employees, and then just the overall notion that raising wages and offering more benefits, how that can or will eventually affect maybe the diner's bill, and how that shift we'll be seeing that shift more at more restaurants as these changes become more widespread.
Well, I think to start at the end, and let me also say any questions that we don't get to, I'm happy to answer sort of afterwards. So please put them in the Q&A, even if you see that we're way behind on the questions that are already on there. We'll get to them, and we'll Parker and I chatted yesterday, and so we'll provide people a way to ask follow-ups if they have them. But Mike Lotta, who was interviewed in the article, mentioned that their restaurants are now open 5 days a week instead of 6. And some of that was because they needed to maintain the high standards. I mean, I had somebody reach out to me, and Mike's a friend. I have tremendous respect for him and Adam and their teams at Fig and Ordinary are two of my favorite restaurants in town. But I remember somebody reached out to me and said, wow, it must be really bad because, I just saw that a restaurant posted, one of Lotta's restaurants posted something to the effect of like, do you want to learn how to cook? No experience necessary. We're hiring, and they're set up well for it. And let's say Fig is especially famous for like training great people. If you look around, there's a lot of restaurants in Charleston that have Fig alumni heading the kitchens. but it was really an eye opener for that person to say like, wow, even there, they're like saying, come on in, we'll train you. Where previous, it would sort of be like, send us your CV and we want to see that you have, minimum of X amount of experience at nicer restaurants. So for them to go 5 days a week from 6, their rent's the same, their fixed costs are the same, maybe their labor at the margin is a little bit lower. But probably what it's meant is that people are just working 5 shifts instead of 6. And so they're salaried people at least. And so you have to make up for that somehow. And I think that's part of why you're seeing restaurant prices rise across the board. I mean, other things, this isn't an issue at Fig, but at the Daily, certainly it's an issue. To go box pricing has gone up tremendously in the pandemic. A lot of demand for delivery services, obviously a lot of food shifting to the go, supply chain issues. So I can quantify that for you. But it's been, somewhere between a 50 and 70% increase on some to-go packages, if you can get them. There's certain things like to-go cups that are just in short supply. And so, one of the things that I like explaining to people is that the margins in the restaurant business tend to be low or mid-single digits. I mean, if you have a very, very successful restaurant, you might be running at 12 to 15%, but most restaurants are running 5 to 7 if they're profitable at all. And so if you have a cost increase of 2% on your cost of goods and your paper goods. So, I mean, I'll give you an example on the paper goods side. So at the Daily, we used to target 1.5% of our sales. 1.5% of every dollar that came in would go back out in paper goods. In the pandemic, it was between 4.8 and 5.1. So we're talking about a 3+% increase. Okay, so if we're 6% profitable at the Daily, literally half of our profits just disappeared because of increased to-go package costs. And so that might look to you as a consumer like somebody asking you, do you need a bag and do you need to go where, instead of just automatically giving you a bag or to go where. That's hopefully what they're doing at the Daily right now. But at some point you have to see that somewhere. So like when we opened a Daily in Atlanta, for example, what we did was we priced our menu items based on it being to go. We just, instead of assuming that it's for here and then we lose a little bit if it's to go, we said, all right, like so much of the food is to go now and to go packaging is so expensive. Let's make sure that we can meet the margin that we need to if it's a to go item, and then we'll make the extra margin if it's for here. And so a lot of us have just had to shift that mindset. The as big of an issue has been, cost of goods increases and just labor costs. And Parker, you and I talked, like we used to bring cooks in 13, 15 bucks an hour. That was pretty common wage for cooks at sort of a restaurant of the caliber of Butcher and Bee across the South. When I would talk with other chefs or restaurant owners, not that we're colluding, but just sort of how's it going? What are you paying? 15 an hour was pretty standard. And now it's really 17, 18, 19 an hour is standard. And, one point I'd like to make is I don't chagrin it. Like I'm happy for people making more money. I'm not looking for ways to pay people less. Like I actually think it's good. I think food should cost a little bit more than it does. And I think that labor should cost more than it does. It needs to be a sustainable job. It needs to be a job that, you can be a line cook now and make $40,000 a year, not in a salaried position. And, some people might be listening and say $40,000 a year, that's nothing. But I would tell you pre-pandemic, you might have been making $26,000 or $28,000 a year. And so it's nice to see, especially in Charleston, as housing costs have gone up. But there is a certain level at which if it goes much further than this, it's going to be hard to hold the line on pricing or really to be, operating at a profitable level.
Yeah. And I think the more, to your point, the more we can kind of talk about, the margins at restaurants and what goes into everything. I think the more people can understand why their bill is going to be more expensive, and you won't maybe get that reaction where somebody sees an $18 burger and they've totally baffled or say that feel that it shouldn't be that price. There's a lot more that's going into it, and it's interesting to hear exactly what those elements are. So thank you.
And to be clear, I don't like that our burger is 18 bucks at Butcher and Bean. Like, I feel like 18 bucks for a burger is expensive, even if the meat is pastured, even if it's sort of, make your own bun, even if you pay your staff well, it's expensive. I think part of that is restaurants trying to nudge you towards other decisions besides a burger. Part of that is just the cost of things now. But I did see a question in the chat about what channels, sort of where we're advertising. And Parker, you and I had talked about, Indeed is the dominant job site, but I just pulled up. So I get, every time our account on Indeed is set up, that every time we hit $500-ish, they run our credit card, and then I get an email. And so I'm just going to read you from this period in late October. So on 10/26, I got an email that they charge our card $556. 2 days later on 10/28, 557. I'm sorry, 555. So $1 off. And then 2 days after that, on the 30th of October, $550. And on the 2nd of November, 421. And on the 5th, 550. So we're talking from the 26th to the 5th, which is about a 10-day period, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 charges of roughly $500 or more dollars each. So just an incredible amount of money. And one of the issues, there was a question earlier about an HR person. So, the HR's person's job is staff us up. So they're going to go full throttle. They're going to post an ad everywhere. That's sort of like you give a person a hammer and everything looks like a nail. You give somebody a mandate of get us fully staffed, and they're going to go on Indeed and LinkedIn and Monster and ZipRecruiter and all these places. And so we've had to sort of rein that in and build some practices around that. We're happy that the person was working very hard to get a staff, but like I told you, it was 1% of every dollar coming in was going to Indeed, and that's not sustainable for us. So we actually, we get a lot of great leads from our website. We found that we find that we basically hire almost everybody that applies through our website. The fact that they came to us that way versus through a job site means that they deliberately wanted to work for us. It wasn't that they just saw us amongst a multitude of other jobs. We've tried referrals from the staff. That hasn't worked as well as we hoped. At one point, we did a $400 check. You get a $400 bonus if you referred somebody to us. Even that didn't move the needle. We have recently started, I noticed a couple of restaurateurs asking questions in the Q&A. So I will share with them that we've recently started buying Google AdWords to see if we can get quality candidates that way for less than it's costing us on Indeed. So we're about 2 months into that. So don't have great data on that, but we're basically targeting people who are looking for jobs at restaurants that are more sustainable, environmentally minded. There was a question about retention. I love that saying that, like, when you're in a hole, the first step is to stop digging. And that's why we really put more of a focus on benefits and pay. And I think one of the things that, my fellow restaurateurs on the call know, that's a sad thing, but very much true, is that you oftentimes have people that work for you and they've worked for you for a few years. And because they haven't been great at asking for raises, and you maybe don't have the practices to review their pay, you have somebody that maybe makes 16 or 17. But if that same person walked in off the street today, you might pay them 20 or 21. And so one of the things that we've done is sort of systematically go through and try to identify those people and bring their wages up to where they would be, not punish them for their tenure with us, basically. We also started a program where we give people gifts on anniversaries. And once you get to 4 or 5 years and beyond, they start being fairly significant. I think maybe at 5 years, we pay for you to travel somewhere, whether it's Nashville to work at the Bee there, or whether it's New York or some Chicago to work with friends of ours, but you get a paid trip to go work and study in another restaurant for a few days. So try to incentivize that. Another thing we've talked about is we have a simple IRA plan. We match 2% of what staff makes. And sort of, I have this thesis that if we can tell the stories about how much people have saved over 4 or 5 years, that might increase retention. So we looked at that, and we realized that people don't actually they get a semi-annual or maybe quarterly statement about their IRA. So we realized like giving them access so they can check it more frequently and starting to share people's stories to say, you know, some people save 10, 12, $15,000 with us. They save 25 a week. We match them 25 a week. That's 25,000. I mean, 2,500 a year. If the market goes sideways, you know, 4 years in, that's 10 grand plus. So.
Yeah, those are all really spectacular things you're doing, and we're nearing the end of our call here. But Emily, I see a question in the queue from Emily Benedict, and I think it's a really good one to conclude on. What can those of us in the local tourism industry do to help support food and beverage staffing situation?
Well, I think, you know, I realize this might be controversial, but Parker, you and I talked about it. I really think that the only way out of where we are, besides like, unless a third of restaurants close and the sort of supply of workers gets redistributed around, what's left is to fix immigration. And I think, I know that's a hot button, and I just want to state again, I'm not trying to fill our restaurant with immigrants so we could depress wages. I'm not coming at it from we can't find people for low enough that we need to bring some people in. What I'm saying is there are not enough people in America for the jobs that are open. I mean, if you just sort of look at a macro level, I think there's 10.6 million jobs open according to the last report, and 3.5 or 4 million people looking for work. I mean, there's a 6 million shortfall. And so I am planning to advocate in the year ahead for some common sense ideas around creating visas for people. You know, to me, the juxtaposition of people fleeing crime and violence and sometimes walking for a month to get to the border. And some of them are doctors, and some of them are lawyers, and some of them are professionals, and some of them would love to be prep cooks for us. And so, you know, I think that's really the only way to fix things systemically. I mean, unfortunately, it's a hard business. It's, as I say, it's a young person's game. It's very physical. And so I get why people aren't rushing back to work at restaurant jobs, especially because so many of us didn't really have a way to give people a soft landing at the start of the pandemic. And so I get why, if you sort of made a career in the restaurant industry and all of a sudden you found yourself furloughed with no benefits and no savings, that you might want to reconsider. And I think it'll take a long time to recover from that. I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there like us looking to make things more professional. I know one of the folks in your article mentioned, I think it was Home Team, that they're adding vacation days for hourly employees. That's something that we've looked at as well. You know, it's going to take a long time to get it back. And so, you know, I would ask for a couple of things from the guests. You know, one, grace. I thought it was great that you mentioned it. I think it was in Buford. They had signs up asking the customers to be patient.
Yeah,
you know, everybody wants to eat at noon on Friday or 7 on Saturday. So you got to understand, you know, you're coming at us full force and we're working with limited staffing. So grace, if you see a table that's open, you know, understand that maybe the reason why you're not getting sat there and why you're being quoted to wait isn't because we don't know the table it's open. It's because we can't take care of you at that table. You know, we've had to, I think every restaurateur has probably had to leave part of their dining room open in the past few months. And then just a realization also around, you know, we didn't talk about it, but I'd love to see a future article around tipping, because the government interprets that as if you leave a tip, you intend for that tip to go to the person at the counter, for example, or the person who was waiting on you, the person who rang you up. But I think, for example, at the Daily, if you go to the Daily and I take your order, but somebody else makes your coffee and somebody else busses your table and somebody else cooks your breakfast, I bet if we ask people, they would say, I want my tips to get distributed amongst everybody. And so that's actually what we've done at the Daily. We put a sign that says your tips get split amongst everybody. If you want it to go to a specific person, it goes there. But just, I'd love to see some broader consumer awareness around tipping, and more support for service charges and not having tipped employees, and just more of an understanding of how tips work. I mean, At some of our places, we have servers who work a 5-6 hour shift and make $35 to $40 per hour on average. And then we have folks in the kitchen, or in the dish room or in prep room working an 8-hour shift at, 14, 15, 16 an hour. And there's not really much difference between the work that they're doing. And I know some servers would take issue with me, but in terms of the physicality of it, the intensity of it, there's not something that I think would justify the delta between 35 and 15 an hour. So I've always dreamed of having a restaurant where everybody gets paid equally. We haven't been able to manifest that yet, but the more consumers are aware of how things work, I'll leave you with this quick story. Somebody reached out to my wife and they said, a group of us are going out to dinner and everybody's going to tip the server $100. There's going to be 5 of us and we're going to leave a $500 tip. And there was a famous story about a place in Bentonville where this happened. Somebody went out, I think they left a multi-$1,000 tip at the end of the meal, and the restaurant wanted to distribute it amongst the staff, and it sort of blew up to the point I think I read about it in the Washington Post. And my wife did the right thing, I think, which is she sent back a message in the group text saying, this is not a good idea. If you want to do this, let's get, instead of a $500 tip, let's bring $25, $20 bills and let's give everybody that's working that night a $20 bill. That's much more equitable than giving the server 500. So the more people can be educated about the inner workings of restaurants, I think the better we are as consumers and as restaurateurs and business people.
Yeah. Well, that's those are really great points. And Michael, I can't thank you enough for joining us. Your transparency and just your thoughts on this situation that we're going to be continually following, along with tipping. Definitely something that I'm keeping my eye on. So I really appreciate you being here. And like Michael said, we did talk about this yesterday. He's not just saying that if we didn't get to your question and you'd like him to answer it, we have his email address in the chat here. So please reach out to him or me, and we'll pass those questions along to him. I want to ask anyone if you'd like to follow our food and dining coverage. Please subscribe to our newsletter. It's written by me weekly. You can do that by visiting postandcourier.com/newsletter-sign up. And to any subscribers watching, or if you're not a subscriber, you can subscribe to the Post and Courier by visiting postandcourier.com/subscribe. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.